Hello, all of you. Welcome to the next in our installment of Considerations of War and Peace. This is the final chance to reflect and consider some of the ideas that we've found to be hopefully both illuminating and difficult. At times, I'm sure, troubling, perhaps frustrating as well. So, what we have a chance to do now is reflect a little bit on looking at issues that are in the heart of the excerpts. And I think that you should be seeing connections not only between issues and engagements that we've had with authors in past weeks, but past completely different modules. So you may have seen or heard echoes of our earliest Bonhoeffer readings. Hauerwas in this piece speaks to Hauerwas that we encountered earlier. There's a way in which ideas found in Bonino and his Marxist analysis of conflict ties back to some of the economic considerations, especially the pre-modern ones that we find in last module's pieces from Aquinas and especially from Luther. Now, I believe that you should have seen, and in fact, I'll tell you, if you didn't find it, we will work through it right now, that there are two major themes that have re-emerged, threading these excerpts together. The first of those is the idea that is in the extract from Hauerwas this week that was also echoed in our initial reading. That's how we construct our ethics is how we first construct our worship and our theology. And so when we say or believe particular things about God, about the nature of Jesus and his ministry, that changes what we say we should do. And secondly, the tension between whether there are different types of standards or different ethical possibilities with regards to the personalist interior count of morality and the public social aspect of morality. So that paradigmatically is the issue that we encountered in Niebuhr's piece. So not only in Niebuhr, but with precursors in Augustine's ideas of the city of God, or the earthly city and the heavenly city. This also has a sort of double stream model, but that admits that there are ways in which they overlap and perhaps other ways that they're irreconcilable, perhaps if we follow that kind of model. So with those two ideas in mind, that we will be seeing, and you have seen, recurrent themes that aren't just related to war and peace, but that affect how we do theology, how we do ethics, and that there are these two ideas, the inner sense of morality and the external public social sense of morality. Both of these things are found in these pieces. So I want to try to connect a few of those threads here. Now, several of the pieces that you just read are from either ecclesiastical bodies or individuals who represent those bodies. I'm thinking especially the excerpt from the United States Catholic bishops and the critique of Ramsey's critique of the 1966 Geneva Conference. This and Welty's piece, probably more than the others, clearly address what it means to go to war as a nation. Think of the idea collectively being made by politicians or nobles, what have you, but the decision to enter into a conflict and whether that conflict is itself just. So we get descriptions of wars of aggression and defense in Welty, and talk about war as an activity that's a collective one. And in these models, since we're talking about the whole world and the way that conflict works as such, it makes sense that what we are encountering are deontological and utilitarian arguments. Perhaps the utilitarianism and pragmatism is very much at work in O'Donovan's piece as well. He makes a moral calculus that requires we parse just what kind of potential suffering could be inflicted on non-combatants, and the discrimination that we then are required to do in our actions, but not just in our hearts, but in our command and control policies being enacted through our armed forces. To wage conflicts between nation states or warring powers, O'Donovan requires a type of calculus. But what these utilitarian calculations have in common with the deontological claims, the universal claims made by the Catholic bishops, is that they refer to war as such. And it's not asking the question of what should I do, how should I feel? Now, looking at the Hauerwas piece, that's exactly what we get in his defense of pacifism. There's not a deontological claim. In fact, he specifically resists this. What he says instead is that virtue ethics are a personalist account of conflict. He hopes all people to be nonviolent. This is, in fact, the quote. All people ought to be nonviolent, not because of some general truth. By this, of course, we mean like some sort of natural law. Some sort of general truth about humanity, but because all people have been called to be a part of the kingdom initiated by Jesus of Nazareth. End quote. So that type of specificity reminds us of the fact that some ethics are personal. And in fact, by nature, virtue ethics counts as a personalist one. So this is an account where we are called to examine a moral exemplar. There is a normative case of what a good human is. What does it mean to be human? For Christians, regardless of whether you subscribe to virtue ethics or not, there's a very clear sense in which Jesus Christ is the normative example of what it is to be human. This is something that we encounter not only in Hauerwas, but very strongly in Barth's writing on Jesus, that we understand through Christ what it means to be human. There's a normative aspect. Against the standard of Jesus, all the rest of humanity is judged. Now, the nature of that judgment is something beyond the ken of just this class. But nevertheless, that's an uncontroversial idea. To say that there is a person against whom we are held in contrast, and for the overwhelming majority of the Christian church, we come up short in our comparison to Jesus because of what? Because of sin. And so it's sin that for Hauerwas in the personalist account affects and infects our idea of just what it means to think about truth, to think about the way the world works. And so because sin so infects our ability to think about the way the world is, not only does sin affect the world and the actions, but how we even conceive of it is in that personalist account affected by sin. And so it's only through looking to the example and then following the example of the true human, which is Christ, that we can then even begin to assess and examine how the world ought to work. So that focus on the individual, as we find in Hauerwas, is very much an example that finds resonance with the questions that you're asking. Now, to pivot very hard, in the piece from Bonino, there's a surprising middle ground that relies on some of the same ideas that we encountered in an earlier piece from Bonhoeffer. Specifically, the idea that humanity, we as men and women, are alienated from ourselves. So if you remember in Bonhoeffer, the idea is that sin is the thing that alienates us both from ourselves and from God. So Bonhoeffer's take is then to say that any type of worldly order or structure is actually just an attempt for us to reconnect with ourselves, to understand who we are again, but that fundamentally ignores the rupture in between humanity, in fact, all of creation's relation to the Creator God. So that idea of sin as being the force, that which alienates, and in this case, a double alienation, is in some ways transposed via a Marxist lens in the writings of Benigno. I assure you that's an original thought of mine. You probably won't find that anywhere else because it's a strange connection of words. The idea that a German Protestant neo-Orthodox writer could in fact be reinterpreting a Marxist concept and find consonance in a theologian coming out of the global south writing in the liberation theology trend. Highly unusual, but this is why I think it's great to have such a wide range of voices to interpret. Because what we get in Benigno, so in the Marxist analysis, class structure is fundamentally divided in modern capitalist societies in between those who own the means of production and those who have to sell their labor, those who don't control the means. So this is the capitalist class and the proletariat. And the experience of being a part of the proletariat is alienating because those workers do not control. They don't have real access to the fruits of their labor. Instead, it's mediated by the wages. So they have to sell their labor in order to even buy the things that they themselves make. This is a profoundly alienating experience. And as Benigno says, this bears some relation to the type of alienation that Paul speaks of with regards to acts of the law. This type of alienation is, of course, something that's wholly absent from the considerations of Aquinas, Luther, or Augustine, because they're all writing in a society that predates modern capitalism. And there's a fundamental difference in between all economic systems that came before capitalism and what we are living in now in the Marxist model. Fundamentally, because in all previous iterations of economic arrangements, there were both responsibilities and rights or expectations. So, Dad, I love you. I love you too, Fundy. Little childhood interjection. So what happens in the system that existed in Europe prior to modern capitalism, what we usually call feudalism, was one in which there were both landowners. There was an upper class and a lower class. So we have the aristocracy and plebs or serfs, but both sides had responsibilities to the other. So it may have been that labor was due to the lord of the manor, but the lord in turn had a responsibility and duty to protect those who worked for him. That type of reciprocal relationship is changed by the commodification of labor. And that's the milieu in which Marx writes. And for Benigno, the reason this piece, which is on liberation theology and Marxist analysis, shows up in the chapter on War and Peace is because the alienation that is experienced by individuals, especially by those who are oppressed, can be experienced in multiple ways. So the liberation use of Marxist sociology claims that those who experience oppression, those who are in a subclass in areas like the global south that have experienced oppression not only through economic devices but also imperialistic devices. This is coming, we first see liberation theology appearing in the post-colonial period, where societies that had formerly been exploited for their material resources are developing a degree of autonomy. And in that liberative struggle, the struggle for autonomy, there's an attempt by these theologians to reckon with the inherent justice or injustice of that act. So, putting this all together, what that means is that Benigno sees humans, especially those who are oppressed, as being alienated from themselves, not only because of the Marxist alienation from their labor, but also theologically from their own humanity. Systematic sin, especially the structures of capitalist exploitation and imperialism and colonialism, prevents people from being themselves. They are alienated by these structures. And so the struggle for liberation is not only a struggle for freedom, but it's a struggle for their very selves. As Benigno states, there's actually an incapability on the part of those who are oppressed to actually live in covenant relationship with God, because they are denied their humanity, and God covenants with humans. The struggle for liberation is actually a struggle to return to the possibility of right relationship with God. I'm going to say that one more time. The struggle for liberation, and I'll add, even if that struggle is a violent one, is a struggle to return to the humanity that is the necessary precondition for the relationship with God. And this is the justification, the unfortunate justification for violence or the possibility of conflict that is found within liberation theology. So the way that this piece is different, I think, from either Hauerwas's personalist account or the types of normative universal accounts that we find in Welty and from the Catholic bishops, is that those accounts either portray conflict as happening on a level playing field, so state actors fighting state actors, and then just war theory is an adjudication of what types of actions are permissible in conflict. Or we have the deeply personal level of Hauerwas that sees in the individual a type of human. So the individual human must determine what their actions should look like. And they do that adjudication in light of the normative example of Christ. But Benigno says that in these types of struggles, where state-on-state actions or even popular uprisings in between a group of people, so civil action, civil disobedience versus top-down government authority, these actions do involve humans. I mean, governments are made up of people. This is an obvious truism. We might be operating in what some people call technocratic states, but it doesn't mean that robots and machines do all the work. Now, the difference of Benigno is that those who struggle are in fact struggling not only against injustice. So Benigno's answer to Luther's claim that it's better to sit under an unjust tyrant and suffer than to revolt, Benigno's response is to say, but the people who are revolting are not fighting injustice. They're not simply suffering. They are attempting to reclaim their humanity. And that's important because God enters into a relationship with humans. And for their true humanity to be fully expressed, they must be free. This is something that I think overcomes the type of submission required by Luther. It overcomes the type of deference to royal sovereign authority that we find in Aquinas, because those situations, those configurations of power require at least humanity on the part of both sides, whether it's a sovereign power or a state, or it's unruly mobs, or even a well-organized insurrection within a country, whatever it might be. Benigno's claim is that humanity is actually at stake. And so the struggle for liberation, in fact, let's be honest about words, the fight for liberation, the conflict, the civil wars, the insurrections, the uprisings that characterize liberation must be thought of in light of the attempt of those who are rising up to regain their humanity. This is a very different claim that, frankly, most of the rest of these authors are not prepared to engage with. And I think represents some of the dangerous or intoxicating potency of liberation theology, because these are claims that mainstream hierarchical, the theology of the elites or the theology of the Western world, the theology, frankly, of the colonial powers is not prepared to answer to. Because the same people that wrote the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights that said that all humans are equal are those very powers, those very colonial forces that were denying the humanity of those in the global south. So this is a strange place to find the middle road until you think that liberation theologians are using a Marxist dialectic. And if we ever took an undergraduate philosophy course, we know that a dialectic involves thesis, antithesis, and this is the synthesis. This is the middle road, I think, of the types of personalist accounts and overarching deontological accounts that we've seen in all of the War and Peace section. So this is where Bonino has really shone through, giving a voice not only to the voiceless and the powerless, and at times perhaps allowing or permitting a type of conflict, or at least saying that it is necessary for the liberation of people to engage in conflict. Now, I'll say one other thing that is simply it's echoing the positive note that Gill ends on. So in his critique, where normally he would simply be pointing out some of the weaknesses in the arguments of a given module, Gill goes on to provide a list of peacemaking activities, because ultimately we are considering war and peace here. And so much of what composes military action or conflict in general involves discussions of what are fundamentally negative things. Nobody goes into war celebrating the idea of battle, death, carnage. However, there is in many of these authors a type of tacit, mournful acceptance of the necessity of it. However, what we do find specifically in the piece referred to from Ackerman, and then in Ackerman we find the sort of multicultural diversity that represents a possible positive model for peace. And then it's the list from Stassen at the very end, the 10 possible 10 practices for abolishing war, is a type of positive peacemaking that is only hinted at here, but that's because as we go forward to consider the human person, as we consider the environment, the way in which we build a better world is a type of peacemaking. And so that is what our future weeks will consider more in depth. So it is a sort of necessary condition of discussing war and peace to assume that war is more difficult, more morally, let's say morally urgent, because literally people are dying. But if we can stop, if we can take a breath just for a minute and engage in a ceasefire, if there is a type of theological or metaphysical pause or truce, we can then consider what it means to live at peace, what it means to want to build the peaceable kingdom. And that's done by caring for the world and caring for each other as humans. So going forward in the next weeks, we will see themes of peace brought up more, even though this discussion, the last 2 weeks, have asked what is so wrong with conflict and when is it ever possibly not wrong. We'll ask more in depth. We'll interrogate some sources to see what is good going ahead. So thank you for listening, and best of luck this week. As we go ahead to our next section over the coming days, we will now be talking about the environment, which is going through a beautiful change right now. I look out the window and spring is almost here. Almost. And I hope that I hope that wherever you are, you're feeling those first suspicions of spring. Take care.